The news hit like thunder over Buckingham Palacethe, kind of announcement that seemed almost too bold to be real. Prince William, the heir to the British throne, had done the unthinkable. In a move that shattered centuries of royal convention, he had officially entrusted his wife, Catherine, with royal military command. It wasn't just a ceremonial title. It was powerreal, tangible authority that once belonged exclusively to kings, princes, and men born into the inner sanctum of the monarchy. Within minutes, the world reacted with disbelief. The media spun into frenzy. The corridors of the palace trembled, and the old order of the crown found itself staring at an unfamiliar future. Behind closed doors, tension crackled like lightning. Courtiers whispered in disbelief. Seasoned advisors traded glances that betrayed alarm. This wasn't simply a symbolic gesture, it was an act of defiance. William, known for his steady composure and quiet loyalty to tradition, had taken a decisive step into dangerous territory. His decision, wrapped in formal language and royal seals, carried the scent of revolution. And at the heart of it stood Catherine, a woman the institution once viewed as a commoner who had married too well, now standing on the threshold of command. To the public, it was a fairy tale twist. To the establishment, it was an earthquake. Questions rippled across breakfast tables and press rooms alike. Why her? Why now? Was this William's way of signaling a new era, or something more personal, a statement of loyalty, perhaps even love, against the cold machinery of monarchy? The answer, it seemed, lay somewhere deep within the layers of their private world. Because this decision wasn't born overnight, it had been years in the making, forged through silent battles, private scars, and a quiet partnership that had withstood every storm the royal family had thrown their way. But in the marble corridors of power, not everyone shared William's conviction. Among the courtiers and the old guard, the unease was almost palpable. The word unprecedented was whispered like a curse. Royal historians called it reckless. Traditionalists saw it as the beginning of the end, a betrayal of the very hierarchy that kept the monarchy intact. Yet William seemed unmoved. To him, Catherine was not just a wife, she was a force disciplined, intelligent, and unflinching, the kind of strength the institution had long underestimated. And then there was Camilla. The Queen Consort, ever composed in public, reportedly received the news in silence. But those who knew her saw the flicker of something dangerous behind her calm, restrained fury. After decades spent clawing her way into acceptance, she was suddenly being eclipsed by a younger, beloved figure. Catherine's new command was more than a title. It was a declaration that bypassed Camilla entirely. For William, it was a matter of loyalty over legacy. For Catherine, it was vindication. For the palace, it was a war in slow motion. Behind every smile, a fracture deepened. And somewhere beneath the grandeur of the royal ceremony, a secret pantone made years ago between husband and wife was finally coming to light. A pact built not on ambition, but on survival. But to understand why William dared to challenge royal protocol and shake the very foundations of his inheritance, we must travel back to a time when Catherine was still fighting to be seen as more than just the Duchess of Cambridge. Behind the flawless smiles and polished appearances, Catherine had been quietly mastering something far more potent than royal protocol power. Not the loud, theatrical kind that draws cameras and controversy, but the silent influence that reshapes empires without a single word spoken. From her earliest days within the royal circle, she learned that in this world, survival depended not on noise, but on nuance. She watched, listened, and adapted, never forcing her way into conversations, but ensuring that every glance, every pause, carried weight. Where others sought to dominate the room, she learned to own it through grace. The palace, a fortress built on tradition and unspoken rules, became her classroom. Catherine understood that to thrive within it, she had to study its people before she could influence its power. She observed the cold efficiency of courtiers who bowed with their heads but schemed with their hearts. She endured whispers, questioning her worth, her background, even her right to stand beside a future king. But through every test, she remained unshaken, patient, composed, and quietly calculating. Over time, that patience became her weapon. Where others burned out seeking attention, she rose by mastering restraint. Those who worked closest to her spoke of moments that revealed her quiet resolve and calm tone in the midst of family tension, a soft smile masking sharp awareness during royal feuds. She didn't argue, she outlasted. The more chaos brewed behind the palace doors, the more unbreakable she seemed. Even during the most difficult chapters, when public scrutiny threatened to consume her, Catherine's demeanour never faltered. In an institution that prized silence yet thrived on scandal, she learned how to let others destroy themselves while she built quietly behind the scenes. And as she endured, something unexpected happened and the public began to see her differently. Not as an accessory to the throne, but as its moral centre. Her devotion to the military families, her compassion toward those scarred by service, and her deep engagement with causes tied to national defence began to shift the narrative. Soldiers admired her humility, officers respected her curiosity. She didn't just attend ceremonies, she listened, she remembered names, and she cared. Slowly, she became the bridge between the rigid walls of monarchy and the beating heart of the nation it claimed to serve. For William, this transformation didn't go unnoticed. His admiration deepened into something stronger, a bond forged through shared purpose rather than privilege. He saw in Catherine the same discipline that defined military leadership, the same unspoken courage his ancestors had claimed as their birthright. She had earned her place not through lineage, but through quiet command. Behind closed doors, William began to rely on her judgment during tense moments, seeking her counsel on matters that stretched far beyond public appearances. The monarchy might have seen her as ornamental, but to him, she had become essential. Whispers within the palace hinted at something more: private briefings, closed-door meetings, discussions about defense strategy that included her name on the list. Few understood it then, but Catherine's interest in national service wasn't symbolic. It was strategic. Her involvement in defense charities and discreet advisory sessions hinted at preparation, as if she were being shaped for something greater. But Catherine's rise was not just earned, it was engineered. Every step measured, every move deliberate. And somewhere deep within the palace, behind those same immaculate walls that once ignored her, others were beginning to realize it. Their power was slipping, and Catherine's silence, once dismissed as submission, had become the most dangerous sound of all. While Catherine's influence grew quietly, Camilla's patience began to fracture. The queen consort, who had spent decades fighting for her place in a family that once rejected her, now felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Every headline about Catherine's grace, every public appearance that drew thunderous applause, was a reminder that the crown's glow no longer centered on her. Outwardly, she remained composed, poised, smiling, regal. But behind the curtain of composure, something colder was forming. Her silence no longer carried authority, it carried resentment. In a palace built on hierarchy, Camilla sensed what few dared to admit aloud: the monarchy was slowly outgrowing her. She had once been the symbol of survival, the woman who endured scandal and emerged queen. But now, she was facing a different kind of threat, one she could neither control nor outlast. Catherine didn't seek power the way others did. She embodied it, and that made her dangerous. Those who worked close to Camilla began to notice the subtle changes: shorter tempers, veiled remarks, and quiet demands for information about the Princess of Wales. Whispers of loyalty and respect became code words for something else controlled. The same woman who once wielded charm like a weapon was now using manipulation cloaked in royal diplomacy. Privately, Camilla's unease turned into obsession. Reports of leaked conversations began to circulate among senior courtiers, murmurs of jealousy disguised as concern. She questioned Catherine's growing influence over the military, hinting that such involvement blurred the line between duty and ambition. But beneath the polite phrasing was panic. For years, Camilla had thrived in the shadow of tradition, using it to protect her reign. Now, that same tradition was turning against her, bending toward youth, change, and modern ideals she neither understood nor trusted. Rumors of King Charles's declining health only deepened her fear. Without his steady hand beside her, her influence began to feel fragile conditionally. The courtiers who once bowed to her started looking to William for guidance, their loyalty shifting almost imperceptibly toward the next generation. It was a generational divide that ran deeper than anyone realized, the old guard clinging to ceremony, while William and Catherine embodied a monarchy trying to survive in the age of scrutiny. Camilla's instincts told her Catherine's diplomacy was her greatest weapon. While the Queen Consort sought obedience, Catherine sought cooperation. She met tension with composure, criticism with compassion. Every act of grace became an act of dominance not in appearance, but in perception. And perception, in the monarchy, was power. It was the quiet kind of warfare that left no casualties, only reputations quietly buried. Behind the palace walls, a cold war had begun. Politeness became performance, silence became strategy. Camilla played her role with practiced precision, yet she could feel her command slipping through the cracks of a changing dynasty. For the first time in decades, she wasn't feared. She was being forgotten, and that, to her, was unforgivable. But William had already made his choice, and the command he prepared for Catherine would not only defy his stepmother, it would rewrite the very structure of royal power. In the quiet heart of Kensington Palace, behind doors locked and guarded, something extraordinary was unfolding. William had called a private meeting not of courtiers or public advisors, but of men and women who commanded the respect of nations. Generals, defense strategists, and royal historians gathered in silence around an ancient table, summoned not for ceremony but for revolution. The task before them was audacious: to reshape the image of the royal military, to place its symbolic command for the first time under the authority of a woman. And not just any woman, Catherine, the Princess of Wales. It was a plan so secret that even senior officials within the palace had been left in the dark, and one so daring that its exposure could fracture the crown itself. William's presence in the room carried both gravity and defiance. He spoke not as a prince bound by lineage, but as a leader ready to challenge centuries of tradition. To him, Catherine embodied what the monarchy had forgotten: integrity, discipline, and connection with the people. The old ways no longer inspired the nation, they constrained it. And while the monarchy had long used military patronage as a symbol of stability, William wanted to transform it into something living, something real. The plan was clear: to establish Catherine as the new face of royal command, the heart and conscience of the armed forces. At first, the idea met silent resistance. The military world, steeped in order and hierarchy, bristled at the thought of symbolic power being reimagined through compassion and intellect, instead of rank and bloodline. But William was unrelenting, and when Catherine herself was brought into the discussion, her calm presence moved the room. She didn't speak as a royal. She spoke as a listener, a student of their world. She had visited bases without fanfare, spoken to soldiers without cameras, and listened to widows whose strength humbled her. She knew their language, not through command, but through empathy. Slowly, skepticism began to waver. Those who had doubted her found themselves quietly impressed by her composure, her respect for the institution, and her deep understanding of sacrifice. Over the months that followed, William and Catherine worked in silence, crafting the framework of a royal command that would not simply decorate the military, but represent it. Together, they envisioned a new chapter, one where the crown's authority was expressed through service rather than superiority. To the old guard, it was rebellion wrapped in elegance. To William, it was restoration. He called it the people's discipline, a phrase that would soon haunt the palace corridors as rumors began to leak. For all their secrecy, no royal plan remains hidden forever. Whispers began to spread of private councils, of generals meeting the princess in confidential briefings, of a coming reshuffle within the royal patronages. Tabloids caught the scent of something unprecedented, spinning headlines about a modern monarchy and a power shift within the palace. But beyond the speculation, something deeper was stirring unease. The older courtiers, the traditionalists loyal to the old queen consort, began to sense the tremors of change. And when the whispers finally reached the ears of Queen Camilla, The calm that had held the royal household together began to splinter. Because what William had built in secret was not just a new command, it was a quiet revolution, and the storm that followed would test every fragile thread holding the monarchy together. Camilla had survived storms before. She had endured decades of scandal, public disdain, and relentless headlines that tried to destroy her. She knew how to turn the tide, not with force, but with finesse. Where others would lash out, she waited. Where others panicked, she planned. And when whispers of Catherine's growing power and William's secret military plans reached her, she understood immediately what was at stake. This was not a symbolic reshuffle. This was a declaration of war on everything she represented. If William wanted to crown Catherine as the face of modern monarchy, Camilla would remind him that true power never needed a title-only control. Her countermove began quietly, like all royal warfare does. She summoned the loyal few who owed her their careers, their secrets, their silence. Courtiers who had served under Charles for years, journalists who still took her calls, advisors who feared her displeasure, all became pieces on her chessboard. She disguised her retaliation under the language of duty, speaking of concern for tradition and preserving the monarchy's dignity. But beneath the civility was venom. The campaign was designed not to destroy Catherine outright, but to weaken her just enough to make her seem unready, untested, too ambitious for her place. The media, always eager for palace intrigue, followed the trail she left like breadcrumbs. Soon, carefully worded editorials began to appear, praising Catherine's grace while questioning her experience. Anonymous, royal sources hinted that the Princess of Wales was overstepping, that her growing influence was causing discomfort among senior members of the family. Tabloids resurrected old controversies, twisting them into new accusations. Every headline, every whisper, was part of Camilla's designer smear campaign that looked like loyalty. Inside the palace, the impact was immediate. Senior royals began to murmur behind closed doors, wondering if William's boldness had gone too far. Was it wise, they asked, to rewrite centuries of tradition? Was Catherine's growing prominence overshadowing the king and queen consort? The same questions spread through the royal staff, echoing in corridors once filled with certainty. The institution, built on hierarchy and control, was beginning to tremble under the weight of William's defiance. For Catherine, the attacks came like shadows, quiet but cutting. Every public appearance was dissected, every gesture analyzed. She was painted as the silent manipulator, the woman behind the prince's rebellion. Yet she remained composed. The same calm that had once earned her ridicule now became her shield. She refused to respond, refused to play into the chaos, and that composure only deepened William's resolve. Their partnership, tested under fire, became stronger. Behind the gilded facade of royal civility, they were fighting not just for a title, but for survival. The tabloids began to hint at something darker, a silent crisis inside the palace. Rumors of rifts, arguments, and secret meetings filled the air. The monarchy's image of unity was cracking, and the world was watching. Camilla's plan was working for now, but what she couldn't see was that the very storm she unleashed was also clearing the path for what came next. Because while she was playing defense, William was preparing his final move. And even as the palace waged its quiet war, William moved forward with the ceremonial day that would mark the end of one era and the dangerous beginning of another. It was meant to be ceremonial, but everyone knew it was war. Under the grey stretch of the London sky, the Windsor courtyard fell silent as Catherine stepped forward. Every movement, every breath, carried centuries of tradition now teetering on the edge of transformation. This was not just a public engagement, it was an execution of power. William's voice, steady yet charged, cut through the still air as he declared, "By my authority, I entrust this command to Her Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales." At that moment, history trembled. What had once been a world ruled by men, governed by hierarchy, was now bending toward a woman whose strength had been forged in silence. The ceremony unfolded with precision, royal guards in formation. Banners raised in solemn unity, yet beneath the surface, tension brewed like a quiet storm. Camilla's absence was the first whisper of rebellion. Officially, it was explained as a scheduling conflict, but the truth lingered in every journalist's pen and every nobleman's stare. Her absence was a statement that spoke louder than any protest. To those who understood the language of power, it meant only one thing. The Queen Consort had withdrawn her approval, and the monarchy stood divided. But Catherine, poised and unflinching, did not falter. She embodied composure, the kind that commanded not just respect but reverence. As she accepted the insignia of leadership from William's hands, her calm defied the chaos surrounding her. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, uncertain, restrained, but it grew, wave upon wave, until it filled the courtyard like a roar of inevitability. Soldiers saluted her not as a figurehead, but as their new commander of the Royal Honor Guard. For them, this was more than royal theatre. It was a symbol that loyalty could belong to principle, not just blood. Inside the palace, however, the reaction was colder. Among courtiers, the applause outside sounded like an alarm bell. To them, Catherine's elevation blurred lines that had defined the monarchy for generations. Too political, one whispered. Too modern, said another. The divide between the old and the new deepened with every cheer that echoed beyond the gates. And yet, William remained composed, his gaze fixed on Catherine not as a prince upholding duty, but as a man fulfilling a promise. Then came her speech, brief, but potent. Her voice carried the steadiness of someone who knew her words would be dissected for decades. She spoke of loyalty, unity, and service. But woven between those words were veiled messages, sharpened like daggers hidden behind silk. True strength, she said, is not inherited. It is earned through the trust of those we serve. It was a statement of devotion, yes, but also a challenge, one that many interpreted as a pointed message to those clinging to the old order. Camilla's name was never mentioned, yet her presence haunted every syllable. As Catherine concluded, the court erupted in applause again. The world saw triumphal modern monarchy taking its boldest step yet. But within the palace walls, victory tasted like betrayal. There were eyes watching from behind curtains, lips murmuring oaths of vengeance, and minds already plotting the next move. Because while the world celebrated Catherine's ascent, another story was beginning in the shadows, one that would threaten to undo everything they had built. And as applause echoed across the courtyard, something far more dangerous was unfolding behind closed doors, an act of defiance that could undo everything. Days after the ceremony, when the echoes of applause had barely faded, a storm unlike any other broke across Britain. A confidential letter, signed, sealed, and unmistakably royal, has surfaced. Its contents were explosive. It claimed that Prince William's decision to grant Catherine command had bypassed official approval from the reigning Queen Consort. Worse still, it implied that the act had been carried out without consultation, painting the future king as reckless, even insubordinate. Within hours, the letter had been leaked to the press, its ink still fresh, its intent unmistakably cruel. And when investigators traced it back, all paths led to one place: the office of a senior aide loyal to Camilla. The media erupted. Headlines screamed betrayal. Morning talk shows turned royal protocol into open warfare. Did William defy the crown? One paper asked. Is the monarchy dividing from within? Demanded another. What had begun as a ceremony of unity had now become the centerpiece of a scandal threatening to tear the royal household apart. Behind every camera flash, every neatly written op-ed, was the same sinister question. Had William gone too far? And if so, who was really pulling the strings backstage? The accusations were merciless. Some claimed William had deliberately weakened the Queen Consort's influence in favor of his wife. Others argued that Catherine had overstepped her bounds, manipulating her husband into a show of rebellion. The internet fractured into factions overnight. Team Catherine celebrated her as the face of progress, a modern royal who dared to challenge the old world. Team Camilla called her a usurper, a calculated threat to the monarchy's stability. What the public didn't see, however, was the quiet devastation inside the palace walls, where trust was collapsing faster than decorum could contain it. As the scandal consumed the nation, emergency meetings were called behind closed doors. Senior advisors, press secretaries, and courtiers scrambled to contain the damage. Statements were drafted, redrafted, and then buried before release. Each word was weighed for risk, each silence calculated for effect. William was furious not at the accusations, but at the betrayal. He had built his life on loyalty, and now that foundation had cracked. He refused to point fingers publicly, but privately, he made a vow. He would find out who had betrayed them. Through it all, Catherine stood remarkably still. Asked by the press, she said nothing. No rebuttal, no denial, no plea for sympathy. Her silence became her strength. Where others shouted, she endured. And in that quiet, the public began to see something profound. They saw not a queen in waiting consumed by power, but a woman holding her composure while the palace turned against her. Slowly, the tide began to shift. Sympathy grew, and what was meant to destroy her instead made her untouchable. But inside the palace, the air grew colder. Every glance felt weighted with suspicion. Every conversation seemed laced with deceit. Someone close had betrayed them. William's trust, once unshakable, began to falter, and Catherine, though calm on the surface, could feel the fracture widening between duty and truth. And as they searched for the culprit, they would soon discover that the betrayal wasn't political, it was personal, because the truth behind the leak was more intimate, more devastating, than anyone inside the palace dared imagine. The traitor wasn't a courtier, nor a journalist, but someone within the royal circle itself. The revelation struck like a blade, slicing through the last thread of trust, holding the family together. For Catherine, the discovery was more than betrayal. It was humiliation. The letter that had nearly destroyed her reputation hadn't come from an enemy outside the palace walls. It had come from someone she had once welcomed at her own table. Someone whose loyalty she never questioned. And in that moment, the fairy tale image of unity she had worked so hard to protect began to crumble. The truth was delivered in whispers, discreet meetings, hesitant confessions, and one undeniable signature that made denial impossible. The aide who leaked the letter hadn't acted alone. A royal relative's bloodline linked to the very throne William was destined to inherit had guided them, even protected. When Catherine learned the name, her world stopped. Shock gave way to disbelief, disbelief to pain, and pain to something colder, resolve. She realized that within the monarchy, betrayal wasn't a scandal, it was a currency. It was how survival was bought, sold, and inherited. For William, the discovery ignited a fury unlike anything he had ever felt. His anger wasn't loud, it was quiet, measured, and terrifying. He saw the betrayal not just as treason against his wife, but as an act of sabotage against his future. In private, those close to him spoke of a confrontation that left the palace trembling with a heated exchange between William and an older royal, whose authority had long gone unquestioned. The details remained buried, but witnesses described it as the moment the crown split in two, the heir no longer obeying, the bloodline no longer united. It wasn't just power being tested, it was family. And somewhere in the silence that followed, Camilla watched. Her lips carried the faint trace of satisfaction, a victory earned not through open war, but through patience. To her, the palace had always been a chessboard, and chaos was just another piece to be moved at will. She believed she had won, that Catherine's confidence would shatter, that William's rebellion would burn itself out. But she underestimated the woman she thought she'd undone. Catherine, though shaken, refused to retreat. The heartbreak only sharpened her will. She appeared at engagements with grace, her poise untouched, her silence more powerful than any statement. The public saw strength where her enemies expected collapse. Crowds gathered, cheering her name, holding signs that read, "Our princess, our pride." In a monarchy drowning in whispers, Catherine's dignity became her armor. She didn't need to speak for the nation. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the communications office scrambled. Press briefings were rewritten hourly. Damage control became a full-time occupation. Yet, the more they tried to suppress the story, the more it grew. Every denial only fueled speculation. Every silence felt like confession. And as Catherine stood tall, the balance of sympathy shifted entirely in her favor. What was meant to isolate her instead elevated her. She was no longer just the Princess of Wales. She was the face of resilience against a crumbling dynasty. And then, when it seemed the palace might collapse under the weight of its own secrets, Catherine made her next move, one that would redefine her legacy forever. From scandal to strength, Catherine rose not as a survivor, but as a commander, not by title alone, but by conviction. The storm that once threatened to break her had instead forged her into something unshakable. With the weight of the crown's expectations pressing upon her, she moved with quiet authority, redefining what it meant to serve. Her new command was not ceremonial, not a trophy handed to her out of pity or politics. It was earned, built from resilience, trust, and an unrelenting sense of duty. Catherine took what was meant to silence her and turned it into a mission, transforming her command into a movement that spoke to the soul of a changing nation. She began with action. Her visits to military bases were no longer routine engagements, but powerful statements. She spoke to soldiers and families not from behind podiums, but face-to-face, listening, learning, connecting. Her empathy, genuine and unfiltered, redefined royal service. Where past royals had relied on pomp, Catherine relied on presence. She became the link between the uniformed and the unseen, between those who fought and those who waited. Slowly, her leadership began to reshape the royal narrative. The monarchy, once seen as distant and ceremonial, began to feel human again, grounded, purposeful, and forward-looking. In her, the nation saw not a symbol, but a leader. She brought reform where few dared, modernizing programs for veterans, improving mental health outreach, and ensuring that the military's families, the silent backbone of service, were finally recognized. Every initiative, every reform carried her personal imprint. And as she moved forward, something else began to happen. The shadow that had long loomed over her, Camilla's quiet influence, began to fade. The Queen Consort, once the central figure of the monarchy's inner politics, retreated from public prominence. Whether it was a choice or a consequence, no one could say. But her absence was felt, and Catherine's presence filled the void effortlessly. William stood by her side, more united with her than ever. Their bond, once strained by scandal and betrayal, had deepened into partnership. Together, they began shaping a monarchy that looked less like an empire and more like a legacy built on empathy, reform, and transparency. They weren't just following tradition, they were rewriting it. And for the first time in decades, the world looked upon the crown not as a relic of the past, but as a promise of what leadership could be. Yet beneath the triumph, a quiet truth lingered. Catherine's power had been born from rebellion. Every smile, every victory, carried the memory of the battles fought behind gilded walls. She had risen not through inheritance, but through endurance. And though the palace now spoke her name with reverence, there were those who would never forget how she got there. Power, once challenged, never truly rests, because when power shifts inside the House of Windsor, it never returns quietly. It echoes through history, one command at a time.